A rancher with 70 days to find a wife, a woman with nothing left but her pride. One desperate deal made in a Nevada saloon. Neither of them expected to feel anything. But the Nevada desert has a way of breaking down every wall a person builds around their heart. Welcome to Westwind Tales, where the spirit of the West comes alive through stories of love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between people. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. This story reminds us that the most beautiful love stories don't begin with perfection. They begin with honesty, courage, and two people willing to show up for each other every single day. If this story warmed your heart, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes and loves second chances, and hit subscribe. There are so many more stories waiting for you here.
That telegram showed up on what was already the worst day of Russell Whitmore's life, though he wouldn't realize for a while yet that it was also bringing his salvation. He was standing in a lawyer's office down in Reno, Nevada, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. Mr. Peyton Reed laid out the details of his father's will with all the warmth of a winter wind blowing down from the Sierra Nevadas. It was March of 1882, and the spring thaw was barely getting started. "Your daddy's will is as clear as a bell," the lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "The ranch is yours on the condition you get married within 90 days of his passing. If you're still a bachelor after that, the whole property gets auctioned off. The money will then be donated to the territorial government for building roads and such." Russell felt his jaw clench up something fierce. His father had been gone for 3 weeks, which meant he had about 10 weeks to find himself a wife or lose everything his family had spent the last 20 years building. The Whitmore Ranch covered 2,000 acres of Nevada high country with mountain streams that never went dry and enough good grazing land for 500 head of cattle. It was worth fighting for. Worth doing just about anything for. But finding a wife in 70 days felt like trying to rope the moon. "Did he happen to say why?" Russell asked, even though he had a good idea of the answer. His father wanted to make sure the family name carried on. Peon answered, "Your father was a practical man. He always said a ranch needed a family to truly prosper, not just one man working it alone." Russell walked out of that office with his thoughts roiling like a dust devil on the horizon. At 28 years old, he had poured his whole life into that ranch, working right alongside his dad. Courting a woman had always felt like something he'd get to later, after all the hard work was settled. Well, later had just shown up like a bolt of lightning, and he was caught completely flat-footed. He headed down Virginia Street, past the saloons and gambling dens that made Reno what it was, and past the train depot where the cross-country railroad brought in all manner of dreamers and folks running from trouble. The town had grown a heap in recent years, filling up with miners, ranchers, and anyone else looking to make a fortune in the desert. Surely, Russell thought, in a town full of people there had to be one soul who needed what he had to offer. That night he was sitting in the Golden Sage Saloon, nursing a whiskey he couldn't even taste when he caught the words of 2 women talking at a table nearby. One of them was Marguerite Keene, the wife of the man who owned the saloon. The other was a young lady Russell had never laid eyes on before. The stranger had her dark, honey-colored hair pinned up under a simple bonnet, and even in the dim light of the lamps, he could see how tired she was. "I surely appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Keene, but I can't keep imposing on you," the young woman was saying. Her voice was proper, like someone who'd had good schooling back east. "I've already been here 3 days, and I have to find some work or a place to stay that I can afford." "Nonsense, dear. You're welcome to stay in the room above the saloon for as long as you need," Marjorie said back. But the way she said it suggested the offer wasn't a permanent one. Though I have to admit, finding decent work for a woman on her own is a tough row to hoe in Reno. Most respectable jobs want references, and considering your situation, the young woman's shoulders slumped a little. "I understand. I'll find something. I have to." Before he even knew what he was doing, Russell found himself standing up and walking over to their table. Both ladies looked up, surprised, as he took off his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. "Begging your pardon for the interruption, ma'ams," he said. My name is Russell Whitmore. I own a ranch just north of town, and I couldn't help but overhear that you're looking for work, miss." The young woman's eyes went wide. They were a striking shade of gray-green, the color of sagebrush after a good rain. "I am, Mr. Whitmore. My name is Hannah Erickson." "Miss Erickson just arrived from Boston last week," Marge Gary explained, her eyes suddenly sparkling with interest. "She came all this way out west to get married, but the fella she was meeting turned out to be less than truthful about his life." A hot blush crept up Hannah's neck. "He was already married. His wife made that abundantly clear when I showed up at what I thought was going to be my new home." Russell felt a hot flash of anger for a man he'd never even met. What kind of low-down snake would trick a woman like that? "That's just wrong. I am truly sorry you had to go through such a thing." "Thank you," Hannah said, her voice soft. "But being sorry doesn't fix the mess I'm in. I used almost every penny I had for the train ticket out here, and I don't have the money to go back to Boston. Not that I would want to. There's nothing left for me there now." Russell pulled a chair out and sat, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was crazier than a coyote in a henhouse, but it felt like fate itself had stepped in. "Miss Erickson, I have a proposal for you. It might sound highly unusual, but I'm asking you to hear me out before you give me an answer." Hannah looked over at Marjorie and then gave him a slow nod. "Go on." "I am in need of a wife," Russell said, plain and simple. "My father passed on recently, and his will says I have to be married within 90 days or I lose our ranch. I have 10 weeks left. You need a home and a safe place to land. So I am proposing a marriage of convenience. You would have a solid roof over your head, good food on the table, and everything you need taken care of. In exchange, you would run the household and help me with the ranch's books. My foreman's wife, Maria, lives on the ranch with her family, so you wouldn't be all alone or without another woman to talk to." The words came out in a rush, a lot faster than he'd meant them to, and he saw Hannah's face change from surprised to shocked to something that looked a little like careful thought. "You are proposing marriage to a woman you just met 5 minutes ago," Hannah stated, her voice steady. "I am proposing a business deal to a woman who needs what I can offer, just as much as I need what you can offer," Russell corrected her gently. "I won't sit here and pretend this is about love, Miss Erickson. But it would be an honest arrangement that benefits us both. You would be the lady of your own house with full charge over it. I'm not a hard man, and I give you my solemn word I would always treat you with respect." Marjorie leaned in, her excitement barely contained. "Hannah, honey, a woman could do a whole lot worse. The Whitmore Ranch is a fine place, and everyone knows Russell here is a fair and decent man." Hannah sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table. Russell could almost see the gears turning in her head as she weighed her choices, which likely all seemed impossible. At last, she looked him straight in the eye with those unforgettable eyes of hers and asked, "What exactly would you expect from me in this arrangement, Mr. Whitmore? Please be perfectly honest." "I would expect you to run the household, which is a main ranch house with 6 rooms," Russell answered. "That includes cooking, though Maria often pitches in with the bigger meals, and managing supplies and the accounts, since you're clearly educated enough to handle numbers. And you'd have to appear as my wife in public, so the terms of the will are satisfied. Other than that, I would just expect common decency and for us to get along, nothing more." "Nothing more," Hannah repeated softly, and he knew exactly what she was really asking. "I would not lay a hand on you that wasn't welcome," Russell said, holding her gaze. "You would have your own room. If anything more were to happen between us, it would have to be because we both wanted it." Hannah was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. When she finally looked up, her voice was firm, even though he could see a slight tremble in her hands. "I left Boston because there wasn't anything there for me. My parents were taken by a fever last year, and I don't have any brothers or sisters. The man I was supposed to marry there broke it off the minute he found out my father's debts had eaten up my inheritance. I came out west hoping for a new beginning, only to find out I'd been lied to again. I am tired of being pushed around by circumstances and other people's dishonesty. I am being honest with you, Russell said. This isn't a fairy tale. This is about surviving for the both of us. But it's an honest way to do it. Hannah lifted her chin, showing a streak of pride that Russell couldn't help but admire. Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Whitmore. When would this marriage need to happen? As soon as we can manage it, Russell admitted. That clock on my father's will is ticking. Tomorrow, then, Hannah said with finality. I suppose there's a preacher in Reno who can handle the ceremony. Reverend Matthews at the Presbyterian Church, Marjorie chimed in, happy to help. I'm sure he could fit you in tomorrow afternoon. A wave of pure relief washed over Russell, followed by a cold shot of terror. He was really going through with this. He was about to marry a complete stranger to save his family's ranch. Tomorrow afternoon it is. Then, Miss Erickson, I'll get you a room at the hotel next door for the night and put it on my account. I'll come by for you at noon tomorrow, and we'll go have a talk with the Reverend. That will be fine, Hannah said. She reached her hand out across the table. Russell took it and shook, feeling the delicate bones under her skin, which was far too soft for the hard life of a ranch. He couldn't help but wonder if she truly understood what she was getting herself into. That night, Russell lay wide awake in his room over the general store, just staring at the ceiling. He replayed every choice that had led him to this very moment. He was fixing to marry a woman whose family name he barely knew. Her past was a closed book, and her nature was a complete mystery. It was the move of a desperate man, and he reckoned that's exactly what he was. But then he'd close his eyes and see those sage-green eyes looking back at him, filled with a courage that matched his own desperation. He thought that maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea might actually work. The next morning broke clear and cold. You could still see the last bit of winter holding on to the mountain peaks from way out in Reno. Russell put on his best suit, a charcoal gray wool that was made for him in San Francisco 3 years back, and still fit him right. All those years of ranch work had broadened his shoulders, so the suit pulled a little snug, but it would have to do for a wedding, even one as strange as this. He showed up at the hotel right at high noon and found Hannah waiting for him in the lobby. She had on a simple dress, a deep blue calico with a clean white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun right at the nape of her neck. She looked pale, but she held herself together. When she saw him, she offered up a small smile that never quite made it to her eyes. Miss Erickson, he said, offering his arm. Are you ready? I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Mr. Whitmore, she answered, taking his arm. He could feel her hand tremble just a bit where it rested on his sleeve. They walked over to the Presbyterian Church without a word, each lost in their own thoughts. Reverend Matthews, a kind-hearted man in his 60s with a full head of white hair, met them at the door. He had a worried look on his face. Russell, are you sure about this? He asked in a low voice. Marriage is a sacred thing, son, not something to be rushed into. I am certain, Reverend, Russell said, his voice firm. Miss Erickson and I have talked it all through, and we're both agreed. The Reverend looked over at Hannah, and she gave a slow nod. This is my choice, Reverend Matthews. I'm walking into this marriage on my own 2 feet. Very well, the Reverend sighed. Let's get on with it, then. Do you have your witnesses? Just then, Marjorie Keene came bustling in with her husband, Frank. They were both smiling from ear to ear, acting like this was the love story of the century instead of a desperate deal between 2 strangers. We'll stand as witnesses, Marjorie declared. Every wedding needs witnesses. The ceremony itself was short and all business. Russell said his vows in a strong, clear voice, promising to honor and protect Hannah for as long as they both should live. Hannah's voice only shook a little when she promised to honor and support Russell. When the Reverend said they were now husband and wife, Russell leaned over and gave his new bride the slightest brush of his lips against hers. It was just a formality, but it felt strangely personal. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, Reverend Matthews said, though his voice still carried a hint of doubt about the whole thing. They signed the marriage certificate with Marjorie and Frank looking on, and just like that, Russell was a married man. He had a wife. and he would get to keep his ranch. But as they walked out into that bright Nevada sunshine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just traded one big problem for a whole mess of new ones he couldn't even see yet. "I've got a wagon waiting," Russell said. "The ranch is about an hour's ride north of here. Do you have any things to collect?" "Just one trunk," Hannah replied. "Everything I own in this world is in that one trunk." The quiet way she said it, with a kind of sad acceptance, made Russell's chest feel tight with a feeling he wasn't used to. He got her trunk from the hotel, loaded it onto the wagon, and then helped Hannah up onto the bench seat. She settled her skirts just so and folded her hands in her lap, looking composed in a way that seemed like it could break at any moment. As they rode out of Reno, following the bumpy road that headed north into the high desert, Russell kept catching himself glancing over at his new wife. She sat straight and still, watching the land roll by, with a look on her face he just couldn't figure out. The land out here was sparse, but it had a tough kind of beauty, all sagebrush and rocky hills with the mountains in the distance looking like sleeping giants. "It is very different from Boston," Hannah said at last, breaking the long silence. "Back there, everything is green and all crowded together. Out here, the sky just seems to go on forever. It takes some getting used to," Russell admitted. "But there's a freedom in all this space. Room to breathe and to build. Something that's really yours." "Is that what you've done? Built something of your own?" Hannah asked. "My father and we built it together," Russell told her. "He came out west in '62 during the big mining boom. He tried his luck with silver over in Virginia City, but he figured out pretty quick that the real money was in feeding the miners. So he started the ranch to sell beef to the mining camps. By the time I came along, he had a good operation going. I've been working that ranch since I was old enough to stay on a horse." "He must have been a practical man," Hannah remarked. "Practical as they come," Russell agreed, "which is why this whole marriage rule in his will shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did. He always believed a man needed a family to make his work mean something." "And what do you believe?" Hannah asked, turning to look him straight in the eye. Russell thought on the question for a moment. "I believe a ranch needs folks who care about it to keep it alive. I'm not sure if that has to be a family in the old-fashioned sense or just people pulling together for the same reason. But I reckon we're about to find out." They rode on in silence for a while longer until the ranch finally came into view. The main house was set on a small hill, a solid-looking place made of wood and stone with a wide front porch and a steep roof built to handle heavy snow. Behind it were the barn, the corral, a bunkhouse, and all the other buildings that make a cattle ranch run. Smoke was curling up from the chimney of a smaller house about 100 yards away, which Russell pointed out as the foreman's place. "That's where Miguel and Maria Torres live with their kids," Russell explained. "Miguel's been with us for 12 years. He's the best horseman in all of Nevada, and he runs the day-to-day work around here. Maria, she's a miracle worker with food and medicine. Their children, Alina and Pablo, are 7 and 9. You'll like them." Hannah just took it all in with wide eyes. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "A little stark, but beautiful." Russell helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside the house. The place was clean, but you could tell a woman hadn't lived there. It was all practical furniture and bare walls. The main room was for both sitting and eating, with a big stone fireplace, taking up one whole wall. A kitchen was off to the left, and a hallway to the right led to the bedrooms. "Your room is this way," Russell said, leading her down the hall. He opened the door to the bigger of the 2 spare rooms, which faced east to catch the morning light. It was furnished simply, with just a bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. "I know it's not much, but you can fix it up however you see fit. There's a budget for the household, and you can order anything you need from the general store in town." Hannah placed her handbag on the chair and turned to face him. "Mr. Whitmore, I want to be perfectly clear about something. I plan to hold up my end of our deal completely. I will run your house and act as your wife in public. But I also need you to know that I am grateful you were honest with me. I have had enough lies and deceit to last a lifetime. Whatever this arrangement turns into, I'm glad it started with the truth." "I feel the same way," Russell said. "And maybe we could drop the formalities. You can call me Russell, and I'll call you Hannah, if that suits you." That suits me fine, Hannah agreed. And for the very first time since he'd met her, she gave him a real full smile. It completely changed her face, bringing a warmth to her features that had been so guarded and tense before. Russell felt something shift inside his chest. He realized his new wife was more than just an answer to a problem. She was a person, with her own heartaches and her own hopes, and he had just tied her life to his in ways that neither one of them could possibly guess. Over the next few days, Hannah got settled in at the ranch with a quiet competence that truly surprised Russell. She went through all the household supplies, rearranged the kitchen the way she liked it, and set up a routine that brought some order to the mess Russell had been living in since his father passed. Maria Torres came up to the main house on the second day and found a fast friend in Hannah. "It is so good to have another woman here," Maria said with her pleasant accent as she helped Hannah make bread. "Russell is a good man, but he's been living like a hermit. This house needed a woman's touch." Hannah kneaded the dough like she'd been doing it her whole life. "I'm still just finding my way around. This place is a whole different world from back east." "You will get the hang of it," Maria promised her. "And if you need a single thing, you hear me. You come and find me. Out here, we look after our own. It is the only way we make it." Russell, who was listening from the hallway as he came in for his midday meal, felt a warmth spread through his chest. Maybe this whole thing was going to work out after all. Hannah was learning fast, settling into the hard rhythm of ranch life with a grit he had to respect. But at night, lying in his own bed just down the hall from hers, Russell was more and more aware of his new wife being in the house. He could hear her moving around, getting ready for bed, and his mind would conjure up pictures that had no business in a practical arrangement. He told himself firmly he had given his word, that he would not touch her unless she wanted him to. But his body did not seem to care much about promises. For her part, Hannah was just as confused. Russell Whitmore was not the man she had braced herself for. He was always a gentleman, waking before dawn to bring in wood for the stove, so the kitchen would be warm when she came out to cook breakfast. He asked for her thoughts on running the house, and he actually paid attention to her answers. He worked from sunup to sundown managing the ranch, but he never missed a meal she cooked, always saying something nice about her food and asking about her day. He was not like James, the Boston banker, who had sweet-talked her with empty promises, only to leave her high and dry when her father's business went under. He was not like Martin, the cheat who had tricked her into coming west with talk of marriage, all while hiding a wife he already had. Russell was honest and solid and kind in a way she never saw coming. Hannah found herself watching him when he was not looking, admiring the sure way he moved, the way his calloused hands were so gentle with the horses. 2 weeks after they were married, Russell got word that cattle thieves were working the area. A rancher nearby had lost 50 head of cattle to rustlers who came in the dead of night and vanished into the mountains. Russell called a meeting with Miguel and the other ranch hands, 4 men who had been with the outfit for years, to talk about tightening up security. Hannah heard them talking from the kitchen while she was getting supper ready. A cold knot tightened in her belly at the idea of Russell facing down dangerous men. She never figured she would care if her husband of convenience made it home in one piece, but it seemed her heart had not been part of their deal. That night, she knocked on Russell's door. He opened it, looking surprised to see her. He had taken off his shirt and was standing in his undershirt and trousers, his dark hair still damp from washing up. "Hannah, is everything all right?" he asked. "I wanted to talk to you about these rustlers," she said. She made sure to keep her eyes on his face, not on the way his undershirt stretched across the strong muscles of his chest. "Are you planning on going after them yourself?" "If I have to," Russell said. "It is my job to protect this ranch and these cattle." "It is also your job to stay alive," Hannah said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "What good is this ranch if you end up dead?" Russell's face softened. "Are you worried about me, Hannah?" She stuck her chin out. "I am worried about my home. If something bad happens to you, I am right back where I started with nothing and no place to go." It was not the whole truth, and they both knew it. But Russell just nodded slowly. "I will be careful. I give you my word on that. Miguel and I have dealt with rustlers before. We know how to handle our business without being foolish about it." "You see that you do," Hannah said. She turned and went back to her room before he could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She was not supposed to feel this way. This was just supposed to be a practical deal, and that was all. But somewhere between cooking his meals, running his house, and listening to him talk about his dreams for the ranch, she had started to care about him a great deal, and it scared her to death. The rustlers hit them 3 nights later. Russell and Miguel had the men taking turns on night watch, and it was young Tom Hreeks who saw them moving down by the south pasture. He fired a shot in the air and rode like the wind for the main house to sound the alarm. Russell grabbed his rifle and was out the door before Hannah even knew what was happening. She stood on the porch in her nightgown and robe, watching as Russell and 4 of his men galloped off into the dark. Maria came and stood next to her, draping a shawl over Hannah's shoulders. "They will be all right," Maria said with a firm voice. "Miguel has been in tighter spots than this, and so has Russell. They are smart men. But smart men can get shot just the same," Hannah thought. And those next 2 hours were the longest of her life. She and Maria waited in the kitchen, keeping the coffee pot hot and fighting off the terrible pictures in their minds. When they finally heard the sound of horses, both women hurried to the door. Russell swung down from his saddle, moving stiffly. In the lamplight from the house, Hannah saw the dark stain of blood on his sleeve. She was across the porch and down the steps before she even thought to move. "You are hurt," she said, her hand reaching for his arm. "It is just a scratch," Russell said, but his face was pale. "One of them got a shot off before they took off running. We chased them away and got back the cattle they were trying to take. Get inside." "Now," Hannah ordered, and Russell found himself listening to the command in his wife's voice. She sat him down at the kitchen table while Maria went to get the medicine box. Working together, they cleaned and bandaged the wound on his upper arm. It was a bullet graze that had torn right through his shirt and left a bloody track along his skin. "You told me you would be careful," Hannah said, and she could not keep her voice from trembling. "They ran as soon as we put up a real fight," Russell said. "I was careful, Hannah. This is nothing." "It is not nothing," Hannah said with a sudden fire, tying the bandage tighter than she needed to. "You could have been killed." Russell took her hand with his good one, stopping her nervous movements. "But I was not. I am right here, and I am all right. Hannah, look at me." She finally lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the tears she was trying so hard to hold back. "I did not mean to scare you," he said softly. "I am sorry." "I do not have any right to be scared," Hannah whispered. "This is just a business deal. I should not care so much if you come home or not." "Should not," Russell repeated, his thumb gently rubbing the back of her hand. "But you do." It was a statement, not a question. Hannah pulled her hand back and stood up quickly. "I will make a fresh pot of coffee. The men will be wanting some." She turned her back to him and got busy at the stove, and he did not press her anymore. But something between them had changed that night, a silent admission that the lines they had so carefully drawn were starting to fade. In the weeks that followed, spring came to the high desert, for real. The sagebrush turned a silvery green, and wildflowers popped up in all sorts of surprising places. The cattle got fat on the fresh grass, and Russell's arm healed up clean, leaving a scar that Hannah could not help but notice when he rolled his sleeves up to work. They settled into an easy kind of partnership. Hannah turned out to have a good head for numbers and took over the ranch's books, finding a few ways to cut their expenses without cutting corners. Russell learned that she had a natural touch with the horses, a quiet confidence that the animals just seemed to understand. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sun dip behind the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. Russell told her about growing up on the ranch, about his mother, who had passed on when he was 12, and about the year he spent in San Francisco studying business before he knew for sure that his heart was in the land. Hannah told him about her life in Boston, about her parents who had loved her with all their hearts but always struggled with money, and about the education her father made sure she got no matter what. "He believed a woman ought to be able to think for herself," Hannah said one evening, as they watched the first stars appear in the huge Nevada sky. He was not like most men back then. Most of his friends thought educating a daughter was a plain waste of money. He was a smart man, Russell said. You have got one of the sharpest minds I have ever come across. The changes you made to the books alone are going to save this outfit a good deal of money this year. Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. I like having something real to do. Back in Boston, a woman was just supposed to look pretty. Here I can actually be of some use. You are more useful than you know, Russell said, and the tone of his voice made Hannah turn her head to look at him. In the fading light, she could not see his face clearly, but she could feel his eyes fixed on her. Russell, she started to say, not quite sure what she was going to say next. He reached over and took her hand. He placed his hand over hers where it rested on the chair's arm. His palm felt warm and calloused against her skin. Hannah, I realize we started this as a practical matter, but you need to understand that you are more than just a convenient answer to me now. You have become important. Your happiness means something to me. Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. It means a great deal, Russell continued. He brought her hand to his mouth and gently kissed her knuckles. The gesture felt more personal than anything else they had done together. I will not pressure you. Our deal is still the same, but I needed you to know. If you ever decided you wanted more from this marriage, I would be ready for it. Hannah's heart was pounding inside her ribs. She had been wrestling with her feelings for Russell for weeks, telling herself it was foolish to care for a man who married her for practical reasons. Yet here he was, telling her that those reasons had grown into something much deeper. I think, she said slowly, that I might want more. But I am afraid, Russell. I have been wounded before. I have trusted men who were not worthy of that trust. I know, Russell said softly, and I cannot promise that I will never cause you pain or let you down, because I am just a man. But I can give you my word that I will never intentionally lie to you. What I am feeling for you is real, Hannah. It might not be what we planned on, but it is real. She gave his hand a squeeze, a quiet way of accepting his words. They sat there together as the evening shadows grew long, holding hands like two young people courting. Hannah felt a guarded part of her heart begin to cautiously and slowly open up. The next morning, Miguel came riding in from the north pasture. He brought news that one of the new mama cows was having a hard time giving birth. Russell saddled his horse right away, and Hannah surprised herself by asking if she could go with them. It is not going to be a pretty sight, Russell warned her. Births can be tough and messy. I still want to learn, Hannah insisted. If I am going to be a part of this ranch, I need to understand everything about it. So Russell helped her up onto a calmer mare, and they rode out with Miguel. The cow was clearly in trouble, moaning in a low, sad way as she strained against a calf that was turned the wrong way. Russell got down on his knees in the grass next to her, talking in a calm voice as he checked on the problem. The calf is breech, he said to Miguel. We are going to have to turn it. What came next was a full hour of difficult and careful labor. Russell took off his shirt, leaving on his undershirt, and reached inside the cow. His face was tense with focus as he tried to feel the calf's position. Miguel held the cow's head to keep her as still as he could. Hannah found herself holding Russell's coat and hat. She whispered words of encouragement, not quite sure if she was talking to the cow, the calf, or Russell himself. At last, with a gush of fluid and one final mighty push from the worn-out mother, the calf came sliding out into Russell's arms. He quickly cleared its nose and mouth. After a moment that made her heart stop, the little thing took a sharp breath and started breathing on its own. The mother cow immediately turned toward her baby, mooing softly as she began to lick it clean with her rough tongue. Russell sat back on his heels, covered in the fluids and blood of the birth, and smiled with a look of powerful satisfaction. We did it. They are both going to be all right. Hannah found herself smiling right back at him, swept up in the pure joy of a new life and a hard-won victory. You were incredible. We were incredible, Russell corrected, even though Hannah had mostly just watched. This is what being a rancher is all about, Hannah. You fight for every life, every birth, every single season. It is hard work, but it is important. Seeing him there in the grass, exhausted and dirty but shining with the success of saving 2 lives, Hannah felt the last of her walls come down. She loved her husband. She was completely and totally in love with this man who had married her to solve a problem and had somehow become the very center of her life. They rode back to the ranch house in the warmth of the spring morning. At the porch, Russell swung down from his horse and then helped Hannah down. But instead of letting go, he kept his hands on her waist, holding her close. He looked down at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "Hannah," he said, and hearing her name from him sounded like a prayer. "Yes," she whispered, not entirely certain what she was saying yes to, but knowing it was the answer to everything. He kissed her then. It was the first real kiss since the day they were married. His lips were warm and a little chapped from the sun and the wind, and the kiss was full of possibility and promise. Hannah's hands rose to rest on his chest, where she could feel how solid and real he was. She kissed him back with all the emotion she had been trying to hold inside. When they finally pulled away from each other, both of them were breathing heavily. Russell rested his forehead against hers. "I am a complete mess," he said with a shaky laugh. "I should not have done that before I cleaned myself up." "I do not care," Hannah said, and she truly meant it. "Russell, there is something I have to tell you. This stopped being just a deal for me weeks ago. I tried to stop it, tried to keep my heart safe, but I cannot do it any longer. I have fallen in love with you." She felt him become perfectly still. Then his arms wrapped tighter around her waist, and he lifted her right off the ground in a powerful hug. "Say that again," he insisted. "I love you," Hannah said again, laughing through the tears that were now rolling down her cheeks. "I love you, Russell Whitmore, and it is both terrifying and wonderful." "I love you too," Russell said. He set her down gently and held her face between his hands, not at all worried about, never minding that he was getting her clean dress all dusty. "I reckon I've been about halfway in love with you since that very first night in the saloon. You looked at me with those amazing eyes and said yes to the most backwards proposal a woman ever heard. But I didn't want to crowd you. I didn't want you to feel like you were roped into this." "I do not feel roped in," Hannah told him without a sound. "I feel like the luckiest woman alive. I came out west just hoping for a home, and I got that. But I found something I wasn't even looking for. I found a man who sees me as a real partner, someone who values my thoughts as much as my help. I found you." They just stood there on the porch, holding on to each other until Maria's voice carried up from her house, calling out to one of the kids. Russell let go of Hannah slowly, like he hated to, and took a step back. "I need to get cleaned up," he said. "But later tonight, after supper, would you be willing to take a walk with me? There's a place I want to show you." "I would like that very much," Hannah agreed. That evening, after a meal Hannah barely noticed, even though she cooked it herself, Russell took her by the hand and led her from the ranch house. They moved through the sagebrush, while the sun started to sink low, walking a path that went up a small hill overlooking the whole ranch. From up there, Hannah could see it all: the house, the barns and sheds, the corral holding their horses, and past all that, the wide-open range rolling out toward the far-off mountains. "This here is my favorite place on the whole property," Russell told her. "I come up here when I've got something to figure out, or when I need to remember what this is all for." "It is just beautiful," Hannah said, soaking in the view. The light of the setting sun was painting everything in hues of gold and deep purple. "After my mama passed, my father brought me right up here," Russell went on. "He told me that this land would be here long after we were gone, but that what we did with our time on it was what truly mattered. He said you measure a life not by how much you gather up, but by what you build that can help folks after you are gone." I did not rightly understand what he meant by that till I was a good bit older. Hannah leaned against his side, and his arm fit around her shoulders like it was made to be there. "And now Now I see he was talking about a legacy. Not just land or cattle, but the lives you touch and the people you look after. This ranch is not just a piece of dirt with some cows. It is a home for Miguel and Maria and their children. It gives good work to the ranch hands and their families. It puts beef on tables for communities all over Nevada. It matters for more than just me. Your father was a smart man, Hannah said softly. Even if his way of making sure you got married was a little unconventional. Russell let out a laugh. I cussed his name 6 ways to Sunday when I first heard what was in that will, but now I think I finally get what he was trying to do. The ranch needed somebody who saw it as a home, not just a business. It needed you. I needed it too, Hannah admitted quietly. I needed a place to put down roots, a place where I could do something that felt important. I needed a purpose. And what about now? Russell asked, turning so he was looking right at her. What do you need now, Hannah? She raised a hand to his face, her fingers gently tracing the strong line of his jaw. Now I just need you. Only you, Russell. That's all I need. He kissed her again as the sun finally disappeared behind them, streaking the sky with brilliant shades of orange and pink. When they finally headed back to the ranch house holding hands, a quiet understanding had settled between them. They weren't just two strangers held together by a business deal anymore. They were partners, they were friends, and they were something else, something neither one of them had really let themselves hope for. They were two people who had, against all odds, fallen deeply in love. That night, Hannah gathered her things and moved them into Russell's room. He helped her carry her few dresses and personal belongings from her room to his. When it was all done, they stood together next to the bed they would finally share. You sure about this? Russell asked, giving her one last chance to back out. I am more sure of this than I have ever been of anything in my whole life, Hannah answered, and she meant every single word. Their wedding night, which had waited for weeks while respect and affection grew between them, was gentle and sweet. Russell was patient with her, taking his time to show her with his touch, not just his words, how much he truly treasured her. Hannah found out that the connection they had wasn't just in their minds and their friendship. It was something real and powerful between them physically. They fit together in every way, mind, body, and soul, and it felt like nothing short of a miracle. Later, lying safe in Russell's arms with her head resting on his chest, his fingers softly combing through her loose hair, Hannah felt a wave of peace wash over her. I always thought love was supposed to be some big complicated mess, she murmured. All those books I used to read back in Boston made it sound like this terribly dramatic thing, full of arguments and big, showy gestures. Russell's chest rumbled with a quiet laugh right by her ear. Well, I think we had our share of drama just getting here. But maybe the best kind of love is the simple kind, the kind that feels like you've finally come home the minute you stop fighting it. Yes, Hannah agreed, snuggling closer. Exactly like coming home. The summer flew by in a happy haze of hard work and quiet joy. Hannah dove right in, determined to learn everything she could about running a ranch. She even helped with the branding that spring, which gave the seasoned ranch hands a good chuckle. Seeing a lady from Boston working with cattle, she got good enough at riding to go with Russell on his daily rounds, checking the fences and water holes across their massive property. She worked side by side with Maria in the garden, raising enough vegetables to put away for the winter ahead. But more than all the work, she cherished the simple, quiet moments with Russell. Sharing coffee on the porch as the sun came up before the day's chores began. A quick, stolen kiss in the barn when they found themselves there at the same time. Evenings spent in comfortable silence with Hannah reading a book by the lamp, while Russell went over the account books or mended a piece of tack. And nights spent in each other's arms, learning the feel of each other's bodies and the rhythm of each other's hearts. Sometime in July, a lawyer rode all the way out from Reno. Hannah felt a knot of worry tighten in her stomach, afraid there was some new problem with their marriage or Russell's claim to the ranch. But this lawyer, a different fellow from the one who had read the will, just needed Russell to sign a few papers. They were just to confirm that he was married and still running the ranch properly. Everything looks to be in order, Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer said as Russell put his signature on the documents. Your father's terms have all been satisfied. The ranch is legally yours, lock, stock, and barrel, with no more strings attached. After the lawyer rode off, Russell turned to Hannah with a huge grin. We did it. The ranch is ours for good. We sure did, Hannah said, agreeing with him. But instead of the pure relief she thought she would feel, a strange sadness crept in. Russell, now that all your father's conditions from the will are met, what does this mean for our marriage? Russell just looked at her, completely puzzled. What are you talking about? I mean, you married me so you could keep the ranch, Hannah said, choosing her words with care. Now that you've done that, will things be different between us? The understanding hit Russell's face, and right behind it came a look of pure panic. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and grabbed her hands. Hannah Whitmore, you look at me. It's true. I married you to keep this ranch. But I fell in love with you because of the woman you are, because you're smart as a whip and braver than anyone I know, and you make me laugh, because you care about this land and these people just as much as I do. Because I can't even picture waking up in the morning without you next to me, or getting through a single day without seeing your face. The ranch might have been what brought us together, but it is not what is keeping us together. Do you understand me? Hannah felt the sting of tears in her eyes. I just needed to hear you say it. I needed to know that you still wanted me for me, not just because I was part of a contract. I want you, Russell said, his voice firm and steady. Today, tomorrow, and for all the days I've got left. You are my wife, Hannah. Not because of some piece of paper or what some lawyer says, but because you're the woman I choose, every single day. She kissed him then, a kiss filled with all her relief and her love and the promise of their future. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling right through her tears. I choose you too, every single day. That fall gave them the first true test of their new partnership. A dry spell that had been threatening all summer got a whole lot worse, and the creeks and springs that the ranch depended on started to dry up. Russell and Miguel spent sunup to sundown in the saddle, checking the property, trying to figure out which pastures were lost and where they could move the herds to find what little water was left. Hannah took charge of talking with the other ranchers nearby, working together to share what resources and news they had. She even wrote letters to farming experts down in California asking for any advice they could give on surviving a drought. She and Maria worked to preserve all the food they possibly could. They knew if the drought forced them to sell cattle early, money would be scarce through the winter. One especially long evening, Russell came inside after a 14-hour day on his horse. He found Hannah still up, going over the account books by the light of a lamp on the kitchen table. He could see the worry carved into her face as she added up numbers that were likely not meeting her hopes. Come to bed, he said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Those numbers will be right there in the morning. We are going to have to sell more cattle than we planned, Hannah said. Her voice was strained with frustration. Even if this drought ends tomorrow, we have already lost too many water holes to keep the herd this large. I know, Russell said. I have been trying not to face it, but you are right. We will take 200 head to market next week, instead of the 100 we had planned. It will be enough to get us through to the spring. Hannah turned in his embrace to look up at him. I hate to see you work so hard just to have the weather tear it all down. That is ranchin', Russell told her with a tired grin. We're always up against something we can't control. But we figure it out, we get by, and we always come back stronger. We'll get through this, Hannah, you and me together. And they sure did. That cattle drive to market was bone-wearying, but Russell managed to get a fair price for the herd. They cinched their belts tight through the winter, making every last dollar stretch till it hollered. And when spring finally came, it brought with it the blessed rain that filled the streams and watering holes, letting them start to rebuild. More than that, the drought had shown them both that what they had together was tougher than any hardship the land could throw at them. They had worked as a team, leaned on each other, and came out of it with their love and promise to each other, not just whole, but deeper. In May of 1883, just a little over a year after their practical wedding, Hannah figured out she was pregnant. She held on to the news, wanting to be absolutely certain before she got his hopes up. But when she finally told him one morning over breakfast, his reaction was everything she could have dreamed of. He just stared at her for a long second. His coffee cup stopped, midway to his mouth. Then he set that cup down real careful-like, pushed back his chair, and swept her right up into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen with a laugh that was pure joy. "We're having a baby?" he asked when he finally put her back on her feet. "We're really going to have a baby?" In late November or early December, based on my counting, Hannah confirmed, laughing at how happy he was. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased?" Russell cradled her face in his big hands, his eyes shining with emotion. "Hannah, please doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm over the moon. I'm scared to death. I'm 100 things all at once. I can't even name them. But more than anything, I'm grateful. Grateful for you, for this life we're making, for this family we're starting." The pregnancy was no walk in the park. Hannah was hit with a terrible morning sickness all through the summer, and the Nevada heat made her feel worn out and cranky. But Russell was a rock, patient and supportive through it all. He brought her cool water when she needed it, changed his work schedule to be closer to the house when her sickness was at its worst, and rubbed her swollen feet in the evenings while she'd laugh about how big she was getting. Maria was a true blessing, a bottomless well of advice and comfort, having been through it twice herself. She told Hannah what was coming, what was normal, and what she ought to worry about, and promised her that every last thing she was feeling was perfectly natural. "The sickness will pass," Maria swore to her, "and then you're going to feel better than you ever have in your life. You'll see." The second part of carrying a child is a beautiful thing. Maria was right on the money. By September, Hannah's morning sickness had finally eased up, and she moved into a time where she felt full of energy and strength. Even with her growing belly, she kept on managing the house and the ranch's books, flat out refusing to be treated like she was made of glass just because she was expecting. "I'm pregnant, not sick," she told Russell straight when he tried to stop her from hanging the laundry. "I've got to stay active." I know," Russell said, holding his hands up like he was surrendering. "But let me worry about you just a little, would you? You're carrying the most precious cargo in all of Nevada." In early December, just as the first real winter cold settled over the ranch, Hannah's labor started. Russell sent Miguel on a hard ride to Reno to fetch the doctor, while Maria came over to the main house to help. The labor was long and hard, dragging on through the whole night and clear into the next day. Russell wore a path in the hallway right outside their bedroom, desperate to be with Hannah, but he respected Maria's firm belief that he'd only be underfoot. Finally, late in the afternoon of December 6th, his son was born. Maria came out of the bedroom with a smile that lit up her whole face and told Russell he could go on in. He walked in to find Hannah propped up on a mountain of pillows, looking exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny little bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come and meet your son," she said, her voice soft. Russell made his way to the bed on unsteady legs and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had dark hair, just like his own, and what looked like they might become Hannah's gray-green eyes, though it was tough to tell in the dim light of the lamp. He was perfect. "Can I hold him?" Russell asked, his voice thick with feeling. Hannah carefully passed the baby into Russell's arms. He held his son with the same gentle confidence he used with a newborn calf, supporting the little head and cradling the small body against his chest. "He's beautiful," Russell whispered. "Hannah, he's just absolutely beautiful." "He's ours," Hannah said, reaching up to touch Russell's cheek. "Our son, our family." They named him James for Hannah's father, with Russell as his middle name. Jaime, as they started calling him, turned out to be a healthy, hungry little fellow who kept them both awake at night with his cries for feeding. But neither one of them minded the lost sleep. They'd take turns walking the floor with Jaime, soothing him when he got fussy, just staring at his tiny fingers and toes, and feeling their hearts grow bigger in ways they never knew was possible. Watching Russell with their son, Hannah would sometimes think all the way back to that night in the Golden Sage Saloon. She remembered when a desperate rancher had proposed a marriage of convenience to a desperate woman who had nowhere else to go. She'd recall the fear and the doubt she felt, the careful space they kept between them in those first few weeks, and it seemed almost impossible that those two weary strangers had turned into the family they had now. "What are you thinking about?" Russell asked her one evening, as they sat together by the fire with Jaime sleeping soundly in a cradle Miguel had built for him as a gift. "About how far we've come," Hannah said. "About how this whole thing started as a simple arrangement and somehow became everything, something I never dreamed could happen." Russell reached out and took her hand, weaving his fingers through hers in a way that had become as simple and necessary as breathing. "My daddy would have surely loved you. He would have loved knowing that his peculiar will was the very thing that brought us together." "You reckon he planned it?" Hannah asked. "Do you think he somehow knew that making you marry would lead to all this?" "I think he was a practical man who saw that I needed someone to share my life with," Russell said after a moment. "Now, whether he meant for it to be a love match, I just cannot say. But I like to think that wherever he is mighty pleased with how it all turned out." "I am more than pleased with how it all turned out," Hannah said. "I came out west thinking I was running from loss and disappointment, but I was really running toward this, toward you, toward the life we have together, toward our family. I was running straight for home." Russell lifted her hand to his lips and gave it a soft kiss. "You are home, Hannah. To me, you will always be home." The years that came after were not without their own trials. There were bitter winters and bone-dry summers, losses in the herd and unpredictable market prices, and the constant hard work of keeping the ranch running and growing. But through every bit of it, Russell and Hannah faced it all side by side, their bond just getting stronger with every passing season. They had two more children, a little girl they named Margaret in 1885, and another boy, Thomas, in 1888. The main house, which had seemed so big and empty when Hannah first came, now felt like it was bursting with life and noise and the wonderful mess of a growing family. Maria and Miguel's children grew up right alongside the Whitmore kids, making a little community on the ranch that felt like one big family. Alina Torres and Margaret Whitmore became as close as sisters. Young Pablo took Jaime and Thomas under his wing, showing them how to ride and rope and handle the cattle. Russell slowly expanded the ranch, buying up the land next to theirs whenever it came up for sale and building the herd back up to a good, healthy size. Hannah took on more and more as the children got older, not just running the household, but becoming a full partner in every decision about the ranch. Her education and sharp mind for business turned out to be a godsend time and again, and Russell came to rely on her good judgment just as much as he relied on Miguel's deep know-how with the cattle and horses. In 1892, on a warm spring evening, a lot like the one when Russell had first told Hannah he loved her, they took a walk up to his favorite spot overlooking the ranch. The children were all tucked in and fast asleep under Maria's watchful eye, and for once they had a few hours all to themselves. 10 years, Hannah said, looking out over the land that had come to mean so much to her. "Has it really been 10 years since that night in the saloon?" 10 years since I made the best deal of my entire life," Russell agreed. 10 years since I made the most unusual marriage proposal in the history of Nevada. Hannah let out a laugh. "I reckon there have been stranger marriages, but ours sure had a peculiar start, and the best continuation a person could ask for," Russell added. He pulled her in close, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solidness of him there next to her, as comforting and vital as it had been since those first uncertain days. "You ever wonder what might have happened if things had gone another way?" Hannah asked. "If I had said no that night? If you had gone and found someone else?" "Never," Russell said, his voice firm. "I believe we were always meant to find each other, Hannah. Maybe it was my daddy's will that pushed us together, or maybe it was just fate, or maybe we just got plain lucky. But no matter how it happened, I am grateful for it every single day." Hannah tilted her head up to look at him, and he kissed her with that familiar fire that had only grown deeper over a decade of being married. When they finally pulled apart, she smiled up at him. "I am grateful too," she said. "I came out west just looking for a home, and I found so much more than that. I found a purpose and a real partnership. I found a place where I could truly be myself. I found a love that changed absolutely everything." "We found each other," Russell said simply. "Everything else just grew from that." They stood together on that hillside as the first stars started to pop out in the huge Nevada sky, holding each other and watching over the ranch that brought them together and the family they had built. Behind them, the lights from the main house glowed, warm and inviting. Smoke curled up from the chimney of Miguel and Maria's house. Down in the corral, the horses shifted peacefully in the growing dark. It was not the life either one of them had ever planned on or expected. It had started with desperation and pure necessity, with two strangers striking a deal that first night in a Reno saloon. But from that long-shot beginning had grown something truly special, a true partnership, a deep and lasting love, and a family that would carry on for generations to come. Hannah Erickson had needed a place to call home. Russell Whitmore had needed a wife to keep his ranch. They made a bargain, and in seeing that bargain through, they had found everything they ever really needed. They had found each other, and by doing that, they had found a love that turned a simple arrangement into a romance that would last the rest of their days. As they walked back down to the ranch house holding hands, the future stretched out before them, full of promise. There would be more hard times ahead, no doubt about it, more tough seasons and difficult choices to make. But there would also be more laughter around the dinner table, more children growing up on this land they loved so much, more evenings spent together watching the sun dip behind the mountains, and more mornings waking up next to each other, thankful for another day together. The ranch that Russell had fought so hard to save had become more than just land or a legacy. It had become the very heart of a family built on honest respect, a genuine partnership, and a love that had snuck up on them both with its strength and its power to last. And every time Hannah looked at Russell, every time he reached for her hand or smiled at her from across a busy room, she remembered that night in the Golden Sage Saloon when two strangers in a tough spot had taken a leap of faith on each other. It was the best gamble either of them had ever made, and they would spend the rest of their lives feeling thankful for the courage it took to say yes to a future they could not see, a future that turned out to be more beautiful than anything they could have ever imagined. Their love story had started out of need, but it had bloomed into something magnificent, proving that sometimes the most practical choices can lead a person to the most extraordinary kind of happiness. And so they lived and worked and loved and built their life together on that Nevada ranch. Two people who had started as strangers, tied by a deal, became partners, tied by love, creating a family and a legacy that would stand long after they were gone. Their children would grow up hearing the story of how their mama and daddy met, about the strange proposal and the marriage of convenience that turned into a real-life love story. And they would come to understand that the best things in life often show up when you take a chance on something that seems impossible. Russell and Hannah Whitmore had needed each other for practical reasons, but they had come to want each other in ways that went far beyond what was practical. They had built more than just a ranch. They built a home. They had more than just a marriage. They had a partnership. They had more than just a family. They had a legacy of love that proved the human heart can find beauty and meaning in the most unlikely of places. And in the end, that was the greatest accomplishment of all.